founding member of the International Drowning Researchers Alliance, Professor Joost Bierens, we talk about the world burden of drowning.
Thank you, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here in this group of people after such a list of tremendous, impressive and emotional speeches of people who really feel committed to this event. And thank you, Stadas, for inviting me. We already have talked long years about all kinds of different issues, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I was asked to just talk about the burden of drowning, and when I was preparing my presentation, I was realizing that the word burden of drowning was something that is relatively new. We always spoke about rescuing a person, and then I realized that drowning, becoming a burden, gives a lot of opportunities, and it's different from to rescue a person. So my flow in my presentation will go from the individual person to the burden of drowning and how that affects society and which are the opportunities for doing that. So this is the situation when I was a lifeguard. That was the situation. You were there to save one person's life, and that was very important to do so. And then suddenly this element of burden of drowning came there, and what actually does that mean, and what is the opportunity, and who introduced that term burden of drowning? And that was the WHO. The WHO at a certain stage did that. But how such a change from an individual to a concept of burden, change of thinking, was also made clear for me in my field as an anesthesiologist in resuscitation. You know, the initial resuscitation was that somebody needs to be ventilated, do cardiac compressions, have an open airway, and that was how everybody needs to be resuscitated. And then gradually it became clear that most people who are going to be resuscitated are people after a cardiac arrest. And when you have a cardiac arrest, your heart stops beating because your heart is injured. If you then start to do compressions, there's still a lot of oxygen in the blood of such a person. So you circulate blood with oxygen, and that might restart the heart, or you might use the external defibrillator to start the heart. And then a person's life has been saved. But if you have a drowned person, the situation is completely different. The heart of a drowned person is completely healthy. There's no problem with that heart. It's because of the lack of oxygen that the heart stops beating. So if in such a situation you start cardiac compression on such a victim, you only circulate blood without oxygen, actually repeating the dying process, which doesn't work. But because the burden of cardiac arrest by cardiac infarction is larger than the burden of people having a cardiac arrest by drowning, the International Resuscitation Society does not accept that the resuscitation guidelines include breathing as the start of your resuscitation, because the burden is smaller. So thinking from a concept of burden, suddenly your way of responding to a situation is changing. And that also, I think, happens to lifesaving. So the WHO started to understand this when, in the beginning of this century, they started a project in which they wanted to know how many people are dying around the world from all kinds of injuries. Wars, homicides, falls. And in that report, they demonstrated that more than 500,000 of people worldwide drowned each year, which was some 20 years ago. And of course, that drew the attention of many other people. So studies started to confirm that and to better understand how this huge number of drownings could occur, because this was a surprise to everybody. So there were done smaller studies which showed that indeed it happened. And even in some countries of the world, especially the Asian countries, you saw that the number of drownings was 5 times higher than the number of people who died from falls or other injuries. So indeed, it was true. These statistics, they were good. So they started other initiatives. And another study that was also very fascinating, and to understand the issue of why so many people drown, is this figure. And I can imagine it's a little bit complex, but it gives over a period of 20 years in a certain area in Asia, what was the causes of dying of children up to the age of 14. And you see that the line is decreasing. And it is because the white bars are going to become smaller, which most of all is malnutrition. That some of the bars, like the yellow ones, which is about tetanus, and the blue ones about pneumonia, they're changing. But the red ones, which are related to drowning, they remain the same. They increase a little bit. So they're still not very important. But because of all the other causes are going to be reduced because of all kind of prevention programs to prevent diarrhea, to prevent pneumonia, to prevent tetanus, relatively drowning becomes more important. So actually by that reason, so not the number in itself is increasing, but also the relatively risk of drowning increase. So these children don't die anymore from diarrhea or malnutrition, they die from drowning. So this was really a burden, a global burden. And that was why in 2014, the World Health Organization produced a document which addressing this global burden of drowning and preventing a leading killer. They called it a leading killer. And the report included a lot of data about which people drown, under which circumstances, which were the measures that would be taken, how to prevent drowning. And another 4 years later, they produced another report including what could be done to implement all these advices that they had. And then another 4 years later, they did a report in which they could prove that two major measures they were taking. One was swimming lessons and swimming education and water safety education, and the other one was crashes, that indeed they really contributed to a substantial reduction of drownings. And you can see that in the figure below, that 20 years ago it was still about 500,000 of people dying from drowning, and nowadays it's about half of this number of drownings. So there is this burden of drowning, but how to calculate that? And that's quite still a problem, and there's several reasons for that. Because the statistics the WHO has is only those statistics about the people who fatally drown, those who die from drowning. But of course there's also a lot of people who have experienced a drowning process, which means that they have a respiratory problem, starting most of the time at the beginning is when somebody is coughing in a way that he cannot or she cannot resist the coughing, that people have a non-fatal drowning. So they start the drowning process, but during the process they are going to be rescued, or they rescue themselves, and they have been in that process of drowning but have been saved. Other people were about to be drowning, to drown, and they are rescued. That's also a burden, and that's especially the part where the lifesavers play a very important role. But also lay people play a role, where people just unintentionally fall in the water. People have to rescue themselves, or other people have to do that. So if you talk about the burden of drowning, it's very important to really to see where do you find this burden. Is this only those people who die from it, or does it indeed include all the people who fall into the water and needs to get out of the water? Another, and that's maybe more a scientific way of approaching this, is that how do you look to these numbers? If you look to the absolute numbers, you see the curve on the top. And I can go into all the details, but I don't do that. I'll just show you the highest one. Then you see, okay, there's up to the age of 40, the number of drownings is increasing, and then it decreases. But if you look to the age group, so if you compare it by 100,000 in that particular age group, you see that actually drowning is going to be a problem that is increasing at a higher age. And of course I know that most of you think that most drownings occur in children, which is true. Of course it's true in many countries, but in most Western countries like in the Netherlands, because these are statistics from the Netherlands, where a lot of people, all the children who learn to swim, the drowning problem is getting more and more a problem for the older generation and not only for the children. And statistics like that show where actually the problem is. So it's difficult to calculate this burden of drowning and to understand why and where it happens. Another way of looking to it is the exposure. How often are people close to water? We all know that men have a much higher risk to drown than females. But if you look to the exposure, we also know that men have a much higher exposure to water than females for whatever reason. So if you compare the exposures, then actually females have a larger risk to drown because they are less exposed and they seem to be less drowning, but overall related to the exposure, it's more of. So this is something we still need to understand exactly how big this burden is, and it also means that we can look to the economic cost of it, to the number of years of life lost, or the number that you survive without diseases. At the same time, while there's a lot of measures to reduce the drowning, and it seems to work, we also are facing now the changes by climate. And there is clear evidence that the changes in climate are going to affect very much the problem of drowning due to all kind of different circumstances. You know that the sea level is rising, so the exposure is rising. You have all these sudden changes in cold, but also draw and rainfalls, thunderstorms, etc., which suddenly change the peculiarities of water. We have had a problem in the Netherlands where there was a lot of sea foam, where people drowned in sea foam. The sea foam was because of the algae, which were immensely growing because of the increase of the water temperature. So there's all kind of reasons why this is going to happen. And on the next slide you will see a maybe very difficult topic to understand, but I'm trying to explain it. There was a study in Japan where they looked at the average temperature in Japan, what is this, over the years, and took that as the point, and they looked at that temperature, how many people were drowning with that temperature. And then they were looking to all the other drownings when the temperature was higher or lower. And you see in the curve that when the temperature in Japan increased, also the number of drownings increased. So these all kind of arguments to anticipate on when the climate is changing and the temperature is increasing, that it also will affect the number of drownings. So I think drowning is more a figure at this stage than a number. It affects the people who are poor, those who are uninformed, and those who are badly prepared. It's a burden. It's really a problem that needs to be attacked. And that means also that for us it has some opportunities. So what I'm trying to say in the flow of my thoughts is that indeed the burden of drowning still is very well defined. We still need we still can learn a lot about it. We also see that the climate change probably is counteracting all the evidence that all the efforts we are taking now to reduce the number of drownings. But we also see that by framing the problem as drowning as a burden gives a lot of opportunities, and life-saving and life-saving sports can benefit from this situation to look at this. And I think this opportunity is, I think at the beginning of this day, very important. I think it's the right moment. A lot of things that are going to happen will fit within this concept. And I want to finalize with a little story. A story of something that happened to me some 10 years ago. And you made some emotional remarks. For me, this was also a little emotional. I was sitting at a conference in Spain at a morning at breakfast, and next to me there was this lifeguard, sun-tanned, muscular guy, and he had 2 crouches. And I said, "What happened to you?" And I said, "I overtrained myself." And I said, "How could that come?" I said, "Listen, I'm a lifesaver. I need to save a life. I need to sport. I need to train myself every day." He said, "Yeah, I understand, but why do you get hurt then?" He said, "Listen, when you're a formal sports person, you know the day that you have to prestige your top event. You even know the hour, maybe even the minute that you have to excel. You go there, you can visualize, you exactly see whatever you need to do at that moment. When you're lucky, you've trained well, then you get a medal. You became world famous. Me as a lifesaver, my top event, I cannot predict. It could be any moment. I cannot visualize what I do. I need to improvise. I don't get a medal, I save a life. And I think that is very important to realize. Thank you so much.